What would you say if I said saving in video games is one of the single most overused mechanics that a lot of titles should get rid of? You'd probably say I was crazy and wrong. I see you typing out that comment right now. But hear me out. While games and players alike rely heavily on the ability to reload a save at any point in many narratives with meaningful choices, maybe those choices don't actually matter all that much when there is no consequence. After all, if you can just reload a past save mid-fight or whenever you make a decision where you don't like the outcome, then what's the point in even giving you the choice in the first place? And no, just deciding you personally won't save scum doesn't fix the actual core problem. I love giving players more choice. I'm an immersive sim fan at heart, shout out Pray Mooncrash, but in some cases, less is more. So today, let's talk about why that is, and see why saves are so ubiquitous in games nowadays, and what is great about save scumming and reloading, but also how a change in how we view these systems could lead to even more impactful, meaningful, and riveting games. Recently, I finally finished playing Baldur's Gate 3. One of the greatest, if not the greatest RPG ever made, and also one of the longest. And while I couldn't help but love so much of the journey and what it had to offer, something I'll talk about in a full review when I eventually do more playthroughs, there was one little thing that kept bothering me, something I hadn't thought about a lot before this game especially, and that's save scumming. For those of you who don't know, save scumming is when you constantly make save files throughout your playthrough, that way if anything goes wrong at any point, you simply just have to reload to the nearest save file and pick up from where you left off, without something happening that you either didn't like, or even worse, didn't intend for. A perfect example of this is a cute little dog in game you can meet named Scratch. Scratch is the bestest of boys, and even more importantly, has lost his master while they were out traveling on the road, and if you play your cards right, you can actually save him and lead him back to your camp where he will be there throughout your entire adventure, even with some cute scenes with other animals should you invite them in too. But horrifically, if you don't play your cards right, the unthinkable can happen, and you can wind up decapitating this poor little guy's heart, leaving him alone to suffer in the wilderness. And unless you are an actual soulless, degenerate monster, you won't be happy when this happens. I think even on the most evil of playthroughs, murdering this innocent puppy's future might be too much and force even the most hardened of RPG vets to reload that save. But you see, that's just the issue. In games, and especially RPGs with a lot of choice and consequence, there are going to be so many moments where you really don't like the outcome of your decisions. And in Baldur's Gate 3, it's even worse because everything you do in game relies on the roll of a dice. And if you roll a 1, a critical failure, no matter how many stats you had in charisma, intelligence, or strength, no matter how much planning and foresight you had, you lose. Scratch goes bye-bye. So that's why we need saves after all, isn't it? You need to be able to go back and change things when actions go south. But if that's the case, why even let us leave Scratch in the first place? Why give us any choice at all? You know, the first RPGs decades ago originally tried a lot of different things. To capture the magic of tabletop D&D, the entire experience they were trying to replicate in the first place. And some of these games didn't have save slots at first. But quickly, it became clear that they were needed in the realm of video games with bugs, glitches, and unintended consequences, along with the lack of a dungeon master to keep track of everything in his head. So this became one of the big ways that video games differentiated themselves from the traditional tabletop journeys. In tabletop, unless your DM's a coward, when you take an action, that consequence lasts for good. It's common in your travels your character might lose an arm, a leg, an eye, or even their dignity. You don't just get to reload the nearest save and try again. You have real consequences for your actions that you have to deal with. And this doesn't make the tabletop experience worse. In fact, I'd argue it's what makes it even better. It's the reason so many people swear by the in-person experience of traditional tabletop. It's a hardcore, but because of that, much more rewarding experience, along with the fact that you just get to hang out with all your friends. And because of how faithfully Baldur's Gate 3 captured so much of Dungeons & Dragons, more than any game before it, I really felt this missing aspect when playing. because I'm the type of player who tries as much as possible not to reload my saves. But when I got to that moment with Scratch the poor lost puppy, you bet your ass I reloaded immediately. And that's the problem with saves. In a traditional tabletop expedition, I would have to accept my consequences for the rest of the playthrough. My companions would call me a dog hater and tell tales of my villainous deeds. And while at first it would suck so much, it could eventually blossom into a riveting story of revenge as I go on to build an orphanage for lost dogs and save all of them. You see, forcing players to accept real consequences for their actions, even when they were sometimes unintended, is what RPGs, and in my opinion, lots of games should be about too. When you give someone the option to just reload a save, even if they don't use it, the fact that the possibility even exists takes away so much from the choices that you make. For example, why do critical failures and successes even exist as a mechanic in Baldur's Gate 3? A critical failure is supposed to mean despite all of the odds stacked in your favor, you roll a 1 on the dice and something bad will happen. Or with critical successes, the exact opposite. The dice rolls themselves are supposed to add a sense of randomness to the journey, just like we would see in our real lives. And this RNG makes it so much more exciting because you never really know what will happen next. It's what role-playing is all about. But allowing for saves almost entirely removes the intensity of these dice rolls that would otherwise be so captivating. I'll give you an analogy to explain my point further. If you're born a trust fund baby, with all the money in the world you could ever ask for, but you forgo that to instead work hard your whole life to make something of yourself, that's still not even close to the same experience as being born poor. The fact that you even have a fallback and the option to save yourself should you need it, even if you refuse to ever use it, will never compare to the experience of knowing that should you fail, you have no backup plan. It's by its very nature a completely different and more intense human life to be born with nothing. And it's the same reason often people who pick themselves up from nothing are respected more than those who were born with everything, even if they both worked just as hard. And that's how I see saves in games like Baldur's Gate 3. Most people would argue that save scumming is just a way to reload when something unintended or bad happens, but that's the exact issue. We are all trust fund babies and we don't even know it. We are making choices in games thinking they are tough decisions or impactful moments, but they're just as tough as a rich kid starting a business with a warm home to return to should it fail. And there isn't anything wrong with being a trust fund baby or with having saves in games. The issue is, I think players have become too reliant on having this crutch, one that was born during a time when technology required it to exist, and one that now in modern times could start to be relaxed some. And this applies to other games too, like Fallout New Vegas or Mass Effect, where instead of a dice roll, you get skill checks. These games try to solve the problem with dice by making each skill check instead rely entirely on your stats that you picked beforehand. But not only is this, in my opinion, a much less dynamic, interesting, and fun way of telling stories and making choices, especially in RPGs, but also it doesn't solve the issue of people just reloading a save to instead pick another option, or reloading and respeccing into different stats. Because just like how games like Dark Souls or Bloodborne are more rewarding when you complete them because they were hard, I think many RPGs and games would have more rewarding and interesting decisions if you knew you didn't have something to fall back on, that being saves. Suddenly, talking back to a hostile god becomes a sweat-inducing encounter where you are actually worried about the outcome, not just a fun little exchange where you can say whatever you want because at worst case, you'll just reload a save. The way I see it, the actually interesting part of choice in video games is the consequences. How a game reacts to any and everything you do, either in believable or interesting ways. And saves, while helpful in many cases, take so much away from that sense of consequence, because regardless of what happens, you can always just change the outcome. It's not that I want games to be more like our real lives because I think it's more fun. I want them to be more like our real lives because I think it's a lot more meaningful. However, for those of you who completely disagree with me, I found this thread on the Baldur's Gate 3 subreddit that has some really good insight on this conversation. Over 2,000 upvotes discussing how it's okay to save scum, and that it's actually what the game is all about. And this comment right at the top of the thread says it best. I also save scummed all the time with zero shame. It was my playthrough, and if I didn't like how something played out or I got screwed over very hard, I just redid the segment. The only thing that matters in the end is that you have fun and enjoy your story. And honestly, that's right. For a lot of people, and in most cases, games are all about just having fun. An escape from the real world where we get to live out our fantasies however we see fit and craft a narrative and world to our own liking, oftentimes with immense help from reloading and previous saves. But games can be so much more than that too, and especially for people like me, I enjoy and remember experiences the most when they are actually hard or have real consequences. It's not about saying that saves in games are always bad or that most games can't even have them, but I think more games taking the risk on something a little more impactful would be awesome. However, it's a lot easier said than done. For example, one of the biggest reasons saves are necessary is because of that disconnect between the player and the world. Sometimes you make choices in-game expecting your character to say or do one thing, but the way they deliver the lines or commit to the action is completely foreign to what you imagined. Maybe you read a line in a sarcastic tone, but then your protagonist says it in an extremely aggressive way and starts a fight. Or maybe you cast a spell that you didn't think would piss off the people around you, but instead it causes unintended chaos. In moments like this, it feels horrible, because you have to deal with the consequences for an action you didn't fully understand because you had a disconnect between the world and yourself. And these are cases where save scumming actually is quite helpful. Or what about moments where completely unexpected or buggy things happen with different NPCs that ruin a moment? Like for instance, this comment from another Reddit user in the Baldur's Gate 3 thread. I was fighting the hag from the swamp whilst trying to save the hostage she was keeping in the cage. To help with the fight, I summoned some trolls who I earlier persuaded into being allies. After freeing the hostage from the cage, a troll proceeded to walk up to the hostage and Sparta kick her over the cliff to her death. I restarted the encounter. Games are defined by their complex and branching narratives, but with all this complexity also comes a lot of downsides. This player just wanted to save the hostage so that they could talk, but because of no fault of their own, that became impossible. I really do understand how that is such a bad feeling, and it would make sense you would want to reload. Because sometimes it's hard to explain to the player how all of the mechanics work without them making some of their own mistakes. Sometimes the game simply doesn't work as intended, and often it's extremely hard to write dialogue in a way where it's always 100% clear as to the tone in which it will be delivered. In each of these cases, saving can massively help alleviate the problem, and can even serve as a teaching tool to use while you discover more and more about the game and how it works. And it's because of that saves in games are so important. I do get that. Not every game needs the traditional saving system we're accustomed to, but some for sure do. The issue I have is that the trade-off saving provides just isn't worth it in the vast majority of cases, in my opinion, and developers should be striving to design games in ways that would minimize any potential issues. Instead, we should look to new innovative ways to tackle situations where players are given choice and consequence. So how could we solve these problems with saves then, though? What kinds of new ideas and systems could help push some future games into this vision that at least I would love to see? Well, first of all, we already have some great examples. In the XCOM series, for instance, there are gameplay modes with random seeding states. What this means is that anytime you start a new campaign, the outcome of each decision is actually determined before you even make any of them. You are allowed to save and reload, but no matter what you do and how many times you do it, the outcome of your decision will always be the same. This gets rid of the problem of reloading to try something over and over again, but it doesn't solve the issue when reloading during combat or when reloading to pick a separate option instead. Another example is games like the original Kingdom Hearts and many other JRPGs that use specific save points on the map that you must actually travel to and find in order to save your game. This solution solves the issue of players being able to save whenever they see fit and forces you to potentially go back quite a ways in order to actually redo an entire section of the game, but the problem here is that it still doesn't get rid of the issue of save scumming itself. It just makes it a lot more tedious. And I don't think making something tedious is ever the answer. If your goal as a game designer is to make the player not do something, I think it makes a lot more sense to just force them not to do it instead of de-incentivizing it to the point where many players will do it anyways to the detriment of their own fun. Because that's the funny thing. I've had a lot of discussions about this topic on my Twitter account and in my Discord with a variety of people, and the biggest pushback I've gotten so far to my thoughts on saving is actually the idea that why am I even trying to stop people from having fun in the first place in the video games they're playing? And I get that. After all, you are paying for a product, shouldn't you be able to use it however you see fit in whatever way you want? Whether that's ignoring saves or save scumming every encounter. Well, let me give you an analogy as to why I think that no. In fact, you shouldn't, not in every game at least. When I first played the original Dark Souls over a decade ago, I was at a point in my life where I was extremely stressed and overworked. The last thing I wanted to do was sit down and bang my head against a wall for hours trying to beat just one boss. But I paid good money for that game, and because it didn't have an easy mode, all of my personal fun was taken away. I thought it was bullshit that I paid for a product and I didn't have an option to play how I wanted to. But eventually, years later, when I finally got back into the Souls-like games with the introduction of Elden Ring, I realized just how wrong I was. Going back and playing these games taught me how truly amazing and important they really were, not because they allowed me to play as I wanted, but because they forced me to play as they wanted. The games are so memorable because they don't let you take the easy route, or have a mode where the bosses have less health and deal less damage. They require that you instead meet them at their level, and because of that, they give you an experience tailor-designed for greatness. The beauty of art often doesn't come from everything that was added, but sometimes even more so from the things that were omitted. Nowadays in our modern cultures, people are so quick to complain and get angry when things don't go their way, but things not going your way is what makes us human. That's one of the key aspects of great art, and also in games, it's one of the most powerful tools at any developer's disposal. I mentioned earlier how I love giving players choice in video games. It's what makes the medium itself so special in the first place. But those choices are only meaningful when backed up by real consequences. It's not always about you and you getting to choose your own fun, because frankly, a lot of you don't even know what you really want in the first place. The customer isn't always right. Sometimes you have to experience something for the first time to know what you've been missing out on. Sometimes forcing you to play in a hard mode or go down a certain path is what makes a game great, not the fact that you get to figure out when and where you don't want certain consequences to happen. I'll give you another great example. In my most recent run of Baldur's Gate 3, I have been forcing myself to not reload saves whenever I start losing a fight, and this has required me to fight every encounter until I see the game over screen. And when I started doing this, something magical happened. All of those fights where I thought all was lost and I had no chance, I started winning some of them. Fights where I only had 1 HP left on my last hero and I was able to vanquish a giant beast with one last sword swipe that only had a 5% chance of hitting. Moments like this are so much more memorable and meaningful than when you just reload a fight and then do it better this time and wipe the floor with enemies. When you force yourself to not use saves in games, it at first can feel limiting and bad, but it produces moments like this where you realize why it can be so much better too. Lower lows, but higher highs. But even knowing I had the option to reload took so much away from these great moments I had, because even though I had a huge sense of accomplishment, it once again came back to me feeling like I always had an easy way out, almost like having a cheat code in my back pocket the whole time. I can't imagine how much more intense and engaging these fights, and especially these wins, would be if I knew my only option was to succeed or start all over. That kind of pressure is what gives us the shot of adrenaline that makes a game one of our favorites of all time. It reminds me a lot of my childhood when I used to play Dota 2 a lot. In that game, you can get so far ahead of your enemies that you quite literally 1v5 the entire enemy team without even casting a spell. And if you are on the receiving end of it, it feels absolutely horrible. But on the flip side, in those very seldom moments where you're the one with the power, you get to experience some of the most exhilarating combat I have ever had in games, some of which I think back to this day even a decade later. That's the kind of thing you can inspire when you remove saving from games and up the intensity. Because having real consequences is, in my opinion, what games have always tried to be about, especially RPGs that took their roots from Dungeons & Dragons. My proposal for a system like this would be a game that learns from something like Ori and the Blind Forest. In Ori, the saves are actually controlled by a blue essence resource that you collect, meaning you can pick any point in the game to make a save point you return to if you die, but it's a limited resource. This design is so genius because it takes an entire aspect, that being saving itself, and turns it into another interesting mechanic in the game, and allows players to get the saves they know and love without the mindless reloading and save scumming of the past. Suddenly, saving your game becomes an important aspect of strategy itself, and because saving becomes a limited resource, it requires a lot more thought and it makes it a lot more interesting. A system like this would also need the great failure states from a game like Disco Elysium, where sometimes it feels feels like the game is even more fun or interesting when you are failing checks as opposed to beating them. This is because it would show players that even when they fail, it's okay, and that by trusting in the game, they will get a better experience and a more memorable one in the end. In a game like Baldur's Gate 3, this could look something like giving divination wizards a spell that can only be cast once per long rest that saves the state of the game at a certain point in time, and if you die, you return to that point in time, living up to the class fantasy while also making saves in the game a lot more dynamic and a lot more interesting. On top of this, I would make sure the game was auto-saving before every engagement and every door opened or chest unlocked. That way, if you do die or reach a failure state where your party wipes, it just goes back to the last save instantly. In a system like this, you would also need to make sure that players could fast travel at any point in order to get out of game-breaking bugs or come up with some other solutions to a problem they're having. And for those of you that think this sounds like a nightmare waiting to happen, look at how MMOs handle players reaching bugs in a game that's always online with no reloading. They seem to handle it just fine. Or what about another example from the Dark Souls series where when you die, you have to travel back to your body and get your loot? Another interesting twist on the save mechanic that makes it a lot less mindless. Overall, I just think there are so many more interesting ways saves could be handled in games right now, and there are so many core issues in especially single player games now with how saves are handled. Because saves take so much agency, impact, and intensity away from the decisions we make in the games we love. It's not at all about taking away player choice or trying to make it so people can't have their own fun. I think it's fine for games to have traditional save systems too if they are designed around that. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't think games could be so much more interesting if developers started thinking about saves and state in more fascinating ways. Imagine a game like this. Just like in Baldur's Gate 3, everything relies on the roll of a dice, with critical failures or successes. But with each step you take through the narrative, you never are given the option to reload. If something bad happens, you just have to accept it. But over time, you learn that these failures aren't as bad as they seem, because each of them leads to interesting twists and turns in the story, a la Disco Elysium, or even Baldur's Gate 3 a little bit for that example. And as you venture on, you start to realize that every fight, every decision, and every moment really matters. If you make a mistake mid-round during an intense battle, you need to figure out a way to recover and narrowly take victory. If you fail a dialogue check, it might result in you finding a whole new area you didn't expect. If you make a mistake mid-round during an intense battle, you need to figure out a way to recover and narrowly take victory. And maybe the game would even have a mechanic where if you died, you even had to take over a new set of characters. If you failed a dialogue check, it might result in you finding a whole new area you didn't expect. And each decision you make in creating your class and character becomes that much more important because each check in the game becomes a stressful yet exhilarating experience. But not every game needs to be like that, and for some of you, you might even think that sounds horrible. You might like creating a character that you can call your own and you aren't willing to just give him up or make a decision that he wouldn't have made. You might have a character that you love and you're not willing to give up, and you're willing to reload a save in order to get them back. However, I know I can't be the only one who thinks that this style of design and philosophy being used in game systems and layouts from the ground up would be so much more interesting than what we see often nowadays. Why do you guys think Hades was such a popular game? Part of the reason was it doesn't have any save states. You can't save the game at any specific moment and then just reload back to it. It's a continuous story where every death and every success really matters, and the game, NPCs, and narrative reacts to you accordingly. And because of that, it was such a memorable experiences and one of the best games that year. Because you know, the best parts in life aren't when we get an easy way out, or when we don't put in any effort or don't suffer at all. The best parts in life, the ones we think back to most fondly, are when we overcame challenge and adversity and through it all still pushed on to have a great adventure in the end. And while it won't be easy for single player games to be designed without saving in mind, I truly do believe they would tap into a deeper instinct within all of us that would unveil so much more potential in what we play. It honestly feels like solutions for most of these issues with saving for so long have just been crutches, like resorting to skill checks instead of dice rolls, or allowing for unlimited and all-powerful saves and reloads, or anything that removes the extreme downsides of choices and consequences with no backup. But maybe it's finally time that we try and take the risk to make games that could potentially piss off a lot of people, but also might just give us an experience unlike many things out there, and an experience that would only be unique to games. Consequence has always been the cornerstone of what makes choice great in games, and honestly, that's probably because consequence is also what makes choice in our real lives so memorable and impactful. And only by removing this unrelenting reliance on saving, save scumming, and save states in a lot of popular games nowadays can we maybe get to a point where we find something even greater in this medium I love. But I know not all of you will agree with me, and for sure I already know a bunch of you will vehemently be against what I'm preaching here. But that's okay, and that's what I love about this channel and discussing games. Not everyone has to agree with me on everything I say. After all, I also love Cyberpunk 2077 even on release, another unpopular opinion I'm always willing to share. So let me know down below what you guys think about the traditional save systems and games we've become so accustomed to, and whether or not you want to see more games try something new, or if you think most games should just keep doing what they're doing. Because while I have some strong preferences, that doesn't mean I'm always right, and I love to hear other opinions too, as it helps me form my own in stronger ways and for future videos. It's one of the best things about art and discussing art. So as always, thank you all so much for watching. I really do appreciate it, and I hope you all have a fantastic day. Until next time.